Marcus sat in his apartment for the third consecutive day, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. His laptop screen glowed with the familiar blue light of social media feeds, news articles, and YouTube videos, an endless stream of other people's lives, other people's opinions, other people's carefully curated realities. His coffee had grown cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. He was lost in his head again, caught in the labyrinth of thoughts that had become his default home. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was researching how to live authentically while barely living at all. Tab after tab opened in his browser, self-help articles, philosophical treatises, motivational videos. He consumed content about courage while avoiding every opportunity to be courageous. He read about vulnerability while maintaining walls that would make medieval fortresses envious. He studied the lives of great men and women while his own life remained stubbornly theoretical. This had become Marcus's existence, a second-hand life lived through screens, books, and endless internal monologues. He knew more about the psychology of confidence than most therapists, could quote Stoic philosophers on resilience, and had memorized countless strategies for overcoming fear. Yet when his neighbor had knocked on his door the previous week asking for help moving furniture, Marcus had pretended not to be home. When his colleague had invited him to join a hiking group, he'd fabricated an excuse about being busy. When his sister had called suggesting he visit their aging father, he'd promised to think about it and then spent 3 days thinking about it. The thinking never stopped. It rolled through his mind like tumbleweeds across an endless plain, scenarios that would never happen, conversations that existed only in his imagination, elaborate plans that would never see daylight. He had become a master architect of mental constructions that served no purpose except to keep him safely distant from the unpredictable, uncontrollable reality of actual living. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from David, his childhood friend, "Beach volleyball tonight at 6. You in?" The message sat there, waiting for a response, while Marcus's mind immediately began its familiar dance. What if he played poorly? What if the other players were too competitive? What if he said something awkward? What if the weather changed? What if he had to leave early? What if he enjoyed it too much and, then, felt disappointed when it ended? The what-ifs multiplied like bacteria in a petri dish. Each hypothetical scenario spawned 3 more, until his mind resembled a flowchart designed by a paranoid computer programmer. He could see himself at the beach, sweating too much, missing easy shots, standing awkwardly while others laughed at jokes he didn't understand. He could feel the sand in his shoes, taste the salt air mixed with his own anxiety, hear his voice cracking as he tried to make conversation. But these weren't memories. They weren't even reasonable predictions. They were the neurotic fantasies of a mind that had grown so accustomed to simulation that it had forgotten the difference between mental rehearsal and actual experience. Marcus had become addicted to the safety of his own thoughts, even when those thoughts were anxious, even when they caused him suffering. At least in his head, he maintained the illusion of control. The apartment around him reflected this internal state. Books were stacked everywhere: philosophy, psychology, self-improvement, biographies of successful people. His walls were covered with inspirational quotes printed from the internet. Life begins at the end of your comfort zone. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. The irony was suffocating. He had surrounded himself with wisdom about living while avoiding life itself. His journal, started with great enthusiasm 6 months ago, contained entry after entry analyzing his thoughts, dissecting his emotions, planning elaborate routines and goal-setting frameworks. Page after page of beautiful handwriting describing elaborate theories about who he wanted to become, detailed schedules he never followed, and careful analyses of why he wasn't following them. The journal had become another escape, another way of thinking about living instead of actually living. Marcus remembered when this pattern had started. As a child, he'd been different, impulsive, curious, unafraid. He'd climbed trees without calculating the probability of falling, talked to strangers without rehearsing conversations, tried new things without researching them to death first. But, somewhere along the way, perhaps after a series of small humiliations and disappointments that every childhood contains, he'd discovered that thinking felt safer than doing. The transformation had been gradual. First, he'd started planning conversations before having them. Then, he'd begun researching every decision until the moment for action had passed. Eventually, he'd retreated so far into his own head that the outside world felt like a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. Now, at 32, Marcus had accumulated more theoretical knowledge about life than most people twice his age, but his actual experience remained embarrassingly thin. He knew the psychological principles behind building relationships but had few meaningful connections. He understood the mechanics of physical fitness but could barely walk up 2 flights of stairs without getting winded. He could explain the neuroscience of habit formation but couldn't maintain a simple morning routine for more than 3 days. The cruel paradox was that the more he thought about living, the less he actually lived. Each new piece of information, each new strategy or framework or philosophical insight, became another excuse to delay action. Why act now when he could first optimize his approach? Why risk failure when he could spend more time preparing? Why engage with reality when his mental models were so much more comfortable? His phone buzzed again. "David again, come on, man. You've been MIA for months. Just show up." The simplicity of the request was jarring. Just show up. No elaborate preparation required. No perfect conditions necessary. No guarantee of outcomes. Just the terrifying, exhilarating proposition of existing in the world beyond his thoughts. Marcus stared at the message for 20 minutes, his mind immediately constructing a detailed analysis of his options. He could go and risk awkwardness, or stay home and maintain safety. He could pretend he hadn't seen the message, or respond with another excuse. He could agree to go and, then, cancel later, or commit and, actually follow through. Each option branched into dozens of sub-options, each with its own imagined consequences and complications. But, as he sat there in his apartment, surrounded by books about courage he'd never applied and quotes about living he'd never embodied, something shifted. A small voice beneath the noise of his thoughts whispered a dangerous question: what if the life he was so carefully avoiding wasn't actually dangerous at all? What if the prison of his mind was more restrictive than any external limitation he might encounter? The question hung in the air like incense, slowly filling the space with its implications. What if his careful analysis, his endless preparation, his sophisticated understanding of psychology and philosophy and human nature were not tools for better living but elaborate mechanisms of avoidance? What if the very intelligence he prized so highly had become the architecture of his own limitation? Marcus looked around his apartment at the books he'd read instead of having experiences, at the plans he'd made instead of taking action, at the quotes that decorated his walls like museum pieces. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't anxiety or analysis or abstract motivation. It felt like hunger, a deep, physical craving for something real. He picked up his phone and, before his mind could construct its usual elaborate decision tree, typed a simple response: yes. The word sat there on the screen, small and unremarkable, but it felt like a revolution. He had bypassed his mental processes entirely, acted from some deeper place that existed beneath the layers of overthinking and analysis. For a moment, he felt what it might be like to be free from the tyranny of his own thoughts. But the moment didn't last long. Almost immediately, his mind resumed its familiar patterns, constructing scenarios and contingency plans for the evening ahead. The difference was that now he had an appointment with reality that no amount of thinking could cancel. In 4 hours, he would have to leave his apartment and engage with the world beyond his thoughts. The prospect was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. Marcus set down his phone and looked out the window for the first time that day. The sun was still shining, people were still walking down the street, life was still happening with or without his participation. For years, he had watched it from behind glass, analyzing and understanding and planning. Tonight, he would step through that glass and discover what existed on the other side of thought. The weak self that had constructed such an elaborate prison was about to encounter something that couldn't be controlled through analysis, the unmediated experience of being alive. And, in that encounter, Marcus sensed something fundamental would have to give way. Part 2, the destruction of the false self. The beach parking lot felt like the edge of the world. Marcus sat in his car for 15 minutes after arriving, watching people emerge from vehicles with easy confidence, carrying volleyball nets and coolers and lawn chairs as if participating in life were the most natural thing in the world. Their casual competence was both inspiring and intimidating. They seemed to possess some knowledge he had forgotten how to simply exist without constant internal commentary. His hands were sweating despite the evening breeze coming through the open windows. The familiar weight of self-consciousness pressed down on him like a physical force. Every person who walked past his car became an opportunity for judgment, every laugh from the beach a potential commentary on his inadequacy. His mind, ever helpful, began providing a detailed catalog of everything that could go wrong in the next 2 hours. But something was different this time. Instead of using these anxious thoughts as justification to leave, Marcus found himself observing them with a strange detachment. He could see his mind doing what it always did, constructing elaborate worst-case scenarios, analyzing potential social dynamics, calculating the probability of embarrassment. For the first time, he recognized these thoughts not as accurate assessments of reality but as the desperate attempts of a frightened ego to maintain control. The recognition was startling. All these years, he had assumed his thoughts were helping him, protecting him from danger and disappointment. But, sitting there in the parking lot, watching actual humans engage in actual activities with actual joy, he could see that his mental processes had become parasitic. They consumed enormous amounts of energy while producing nothing of value except the illusion of safety. Marcus stepped out of the car before his mind could construct another reason to leave. The action felt mechanical, divorced from his internal state. His body moved while his thoughts continued their anxious chatter, but, for the first time in years, he didn't wait for mental permission to act. The simple act of walking toward the beach while experiencing anxiety rather than being controlled by it felt revolutionary. David spotted him from across the sand and jogged over, his face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. "Marcus! You actually came!" The enthusiasm in his voice was uncomplicated, free from the layers of interpretation and analysis that Marcus would have applied to such a greeting. David was simply happy to see him. The concept seemed foreign and wonderful. "Yeah, well, you know," Marcus began, his mind immediately searching for a self-deprecating comment that would preemptively deflect any potential disappointment in his performance. But he caught himself mid-sentence and finished simply, "I'm here." The conversation that followed revealed something Marcus had forgotten: most people weren't interested in elaborate explanations or justifications. They didn't need him to prove himself worthy of inclusion or provide credentials for his presence. David introduced him to the others with casual warmth, and, within minutes Marcus found himself holding a volleyball, preparing to serve to a group of relative strangers who seemed remarkably unconcerned with his qualifications for being there. The first serve was terrible. The ball sailed wide of the court and landed in the sand with a pathetic thud. Marcus's mind immediately began its familiar routine, analyzing what had gone wrong, comparing his performance to the others, calculating how much his teammates must be regretting his inclusion. But something unexpected happened. Nobody seemed to care. One of the other players jogged over to retrieve the ball with a smile, tossed it back to him, and said, "Take your time, man. We're just having fun." Just having fun. The phrase hit Marcus like a revelation. When had he last done anything just for fun? When had he engaged in any activity without an agenda, without goals to achieve or improvements to make or lessons to learn? His entire life had become a series of projects designed to optimize some future version of himself who would finally be ready to live. But here were people actually living, imperfectly and joyfully, without requiring perfection as a prerequisite for participation. The second serve was better, and the third better still. Not because Marcus had suddenly become good at volleyball, but because he had stopped trying to be good at volleyball. He had started simply trying to hit the ball over the net, a much more manageable objective. With each serve, each awkward dive for the ball, each moment of focusing on the immediate task rather than his performance of the task, Marcus felt something inside him beginning to dissolve. It was the feeling of watching an elaborate structure collapse, not with violence or destruction, but with the quiet inevitability of something that had never been properly supported in the first place. The careful persona he had constructed, the sophisticated analysis he brought to every situation, the endless preparation and planning and optimization, none of it was necessary here. In fact, it was actively counterproductive, an elaborate machine designed to solve a problem that didn't exist. By the third game, Marcus was diving for impossible shots and laughing when he missed them. He was making jokes that weren't particularly clever but that emerged naturally from the flow of conversation. He was sweating and breathing hard and feeling genuinely tired rather than mentally exhausted. His mind was still providing commentary, but its voice had grown fainter, drowned out by the immediate demands of tracking the ball, communicating with teammates, responding to the constantly changing dynamics of the game. During a break between games, Marcus found himself in conversation with Sarah, a woman he'd met only an hour earlier but who was discussing her recent career change with the kind of openness that usually took him months to develop with people. There was no formal introduction period, no careful probing to establish compatibility or shared interests. She was simply talking, and he was simply listening, and somehow that was enough to create a genuine connection. "I was terrified," Sarah was saying about her decision to leave law and become a teacher. "I had all these spreadsheets analyzing the financial implications and the career prospects and the probability of success. But eventually I realized I was spending more time analyzing the decision than it would take to just try it and see what happened." Marcus nodded, recognizing something familiar in her story. But instead of launching into his own elaborate analysis of career decisions and risk assessment, he found himself saying simply, "That sounds scary and exciting." "Exactly," Sarah said. "Scary and exciting. I'd forgotten those could be the same thing. Scary and exciting." Marcus had spent so many years trying to eliminate the scary part that he'd accidentally eliminated the exciting part too. Fear and excitement, he realized, were physiologically almost identical: increased heart rate, heightened awareness, a sense of energy and possibility. The difference was primarily in how the mind interpreted the sensations. For years, he had trained himself to interpret any uncertainty as danger, any unpredictability as threat. But, sitting on the beach, still catching his breath from the last game, he could feel those same sensations and recognize them as aliveness. As the evening continued, Marcus began to notice something remarkable happening. The less he thought about how he was coming across, the more naturally he seemed to connect with people. The less he analyzed the social dynamics, the more fluidly he moved within them. The less he tried to control his performance, the better he seemed to perform. It was as if his conscious mind, for all its sophistication and good intentions, had been the primary obstacle to the very things it claimed to want. The revelation was both humbling and liberating. All those books he'd read about social skills, all the articles about building confidence, all the strategies and techniques and frameworks, they had been solutions to a problem created by the very approach they represented. The more he had tried to think his way into better living, the further he had moved from the spontaneous, responsive, present moment awareness that actually made life worth living. During the final game, something shifted completely. Marcus stopped being Marcus playing volleyball and simply became the playing itself. The gap between observer and observed collapsed. There was no longer a self-monitoring performance and an activity being performed. There was just the immediate, dynamic flow of attention responding to the ball, the sand, the other players, the wind. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Marcus experienced what it felt like to be completely present. The feeling was indescribable and utterly ordinary at the same time. It wasn't mystical or profound in any dramatic sense. It was simply what happened when the elaborate machinery of self-consciousness stopped running. Without the constant noise of internal commentary, reality revealed itself to be far more vivid and immediate than any mental representation could capture. The sand felt grittier, the laughter sounded richer, the sunset appeared more beautiful, not because anything had changed but because he had stopped filtering experience through layers of thought and interpretation. When the games finally ended and the group began packing up, Marcus felt a profound sense of loss, not because the evening was over, but because he could feel his mind beginning to reassert itself. Already, thoughts were creeping in about how well he had done, what the others might have thought of him, what lessons could be extracted from the experience. The analytical machinery was starting up again, ready to transform direct experience back into abstract concepts and memories to be filed away and analyzed. But something fundamental had changed. Marcus had tasted what existed beyond the prison of his own thoughts, and now he could never completely unknow it. The carefully constructed self that had spent years avoiding life in order to understand it had been revealed as unnecessary, not just unnecessary, but actively harmful. In destroying that false self, even temporarily, Marcus had discovered something that could never be destroyed by others because it wasn't separate from the world they shared. Walking back to his car, sandy and tired and more genuinely satisfied than he had felt in years, Marcus understood that he had crossed a threshold. The weak self that had dominated his life for so long, the one that needed constant protection and validation and control, was not his true nature. It was a construction, an elaborate defense mechanism that had outlived its usefulness. And, like all constructions, it could be dismantled. The question now was whether he would have the courage to keep living beyond its limitations. Part 3, The Invincible Man. 3 months later, Marcus barely recognized the person he had been. Not because he had transformed into someone fundamentally different, but because he had stopped trying to be anyone other than who he naturally was from moment to moment. The shift was subtle yet complete, like the difference between swimming against a current and, finally, allowing yourself to move with the water's flow. The volleyball group had become a regular part of his week, but it was just the beginning. Each successful encounter with unmediated reality had made the next one slightly easier, not because the world had become less uncertain but because Marcus had developed a different relationship with uncertainty itself. Instead of treating unpredictability as a problem to be solved through careful planning, he had begun to recognize it as the very condition that made authentic living possible. Marcus now worked as a freelance consultant, having left his corporate job 6 weeks earlier. The decision had surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. For years, he had stayed in a position that bored him because it offered security and predictability. He had extensive spreadsheets analyzing the financial risks of leaving, detailed plans for building a consulting practice, and elaborate strategies for managing the transition. But, in the end, he had simply submitted his resignation on a Tuesday afternoon because it felt like the right thing to do. The difference wasn't that he had become reckless or impulsive. If anything, his decisions were more thoughtful than ever before. But, the thinking had changed quality. Instead of endless circular analysis designed to eliminate risk and guarantee outcomes, his mental processes had become tools for responding skillfully to whatever arose. He still planned and prepared, but he held those plans lightly, ready to adapt when reality inevitably diverged from his expectations. His apartment had changed too, though someone visiting might struggle to identify exactly how. The inspirational quotes had come down from the walls, not because he disagreed with their messages but because he no longer needed external reminders to live authentically. The towers of self-help books had been donated to the library, replaced by novels, poetry, and books on subjects that interested him rather than ones that promised to fix him. His journal had evolved from a catalog of self-analysis into a simple record of experiences and observations, free from the desperate self-improvement agenda that had once driven every entry. Marcus was sitting in a coffee shop on a Thursday morning, working on a proposal for a potential client, when a commotion erupted at the table next to him. A man in an expensive suit was berating the young barista who had apparently made his order incorrectly. The customer's voice grew louder and more aggressive with each word, drawing stares from other patrons and reducing the barista to near tears. The old Marcus would have observed this scene with a mixture of second-hand embarrassment and analytical detachment. He would have noted the psychological dynamics at play, perhaps mentally composing a blog post about workplace bullying or the entitled behavior of certain customer demographics. He might have felt sympathy for the barista but would never have considered intervening. Too risky, too unpredictable, too likely to result in conflict or embarrassment. But the person Marcus had become didn't hesitate. He stood up from his table and walked over to the angry customer with the same natural ease he might use to offer directions to a lost tourist. There was no heroic decision-making process, no careful weighing of pros and cons. He simply saw a situation where his intervention might be helpful and acted accordingly. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice calm but clear enough to cut through the man's tirade. "I think there might be a misunderstanding here." The customer wheeled around, his face flushed with the particular indignation of someone whose authority had been questioned. "This is none of your business," he snapped. "You're right," Marcus agreed easily. "But I'm making it my business because you're being unnecessarily cruel to someone who's trying to help you." The response surprised everyone, including Marcus himself. He wasn't trying to be confrontational or heroic. He was simply stating what he observed with the same straightforward honesty he might use to comment on the weather. The absence of either aggression or appeasement in his tone seemed to deflate some of the customer's anger. "Look," Marcus continued, "I've been sitting right here, and I saw what happened. She made your drink exactly as you ordered it. If it's not what you wanted, that's fine, we all change our minds. But there's no reason to make someone feel terrible about doing their job correctly." The customer's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: anger, confusion, something that might have been embarrassment. The coffee shop had grown quiet, other patrons watching the interaction with the fascination that always accompanies unexpected human drama. But Marcus wasn't performing for an audience. He wasn't trying to win points or demonstrate his virtue. He was simply responding to the situation as it was, without the layers of self-consciousness that would have paralyzed his earlier self. She did make it wrong," the customer said, but his voice had lost its aggressive edge. "Maybe," Marcus said. "Or maybe you ordered something different than what you actually wanted. Either way, it's not her fault, and it's definitely not worth making another human being feel bad about herself." Something in the man's posture shifted. The aggressive stance gave way to something more uncertain, more human. He looked at the barista, who was still trembling slightly behind the counter, then back at Marcus. I've been having a difficult day." "I understand," Marcus said, and meant it. "We all have difficult days. But that's exactly when we need to be more careful about how we treat each other, not less." The customer stood there for another moment, as if processing this perspective for the first time. Then, he turned to the barista and said, quietly, "I'm sorry. That was inappropriate. The drink is fine." He left the coffee shop without another word, and gradually the normal hum of conversation resumed. The barista caught Marcus's eye and mouthed thank you before returning to her work. Marcus sat back down at his table and returned to his proposal as if nothing unusual had happened. But something profound had occurred, and it wasn't the minor act of standing up to a bully. What was remarkable was how natural the entire interaction had felt. The old Marcus would have analyzed the situation for 10 minutes before acting, would have rehearsed different approaches, would have worried about potential consequences and optimal strategies. By the time he had finished thinking about what to do, the moment for action would have passed. Instead, he had responded from a place beyond thought, not thoughtlessly, but from a kind of embodied wisdom that existed beneath the neurotic chatter of his analytical mind. He had acted not because he had determined it was the right thing to do, but because it was simply what the situation called for. There had been no gap between perception and response, no internal debate about risks and benefits. He had seen clearly and acted accordingly. This was what Marcus had discovered in the months since that first volleyball game, when he stopped trying to protect his imaginary reputation and started responding authentically to what was actually happening. He became essentially invulnerable. Not because nothing could hurt him, he still felt pain, disappointment, and uncertainty like anyone else, but because he was no longer dependent on external circumstances to validate his sense of self-worth. The weak self that he had spent years protecting had been revealed as an illusion. It had never really existed except as a collection of thoughts and stories about who he was supposed to be. When he stopped investing energy in maintaining that fictional character, he discovered something that needed no protection because it was not separate from the world it inhabited. Marcus's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his sister, calling with news that their father had been hospitalized after a fall. 6 months ago, such a call would have triggered an elaborate internal crisis, guilt about not visiting more often, anxiety about his father's mortality, detailed planning sessions about travel arrangements and hospital protocols. Marcus would have spent hours analyzing his emotional response instead of simply responding to the situation. Instead, he found himself saying, "I'll be there this afternoon," and meaning it completely. There was no internal debate about whether he could afford to take time off work, no elaborate risk assessment about flying during flu season, no anxious rehearsal of difficult conversations with family members. His father needed him, so he would go. The simplicity was stunning. As he packed a bag and arranged for a flight, Marcus reflected on how different this version of decisive action felt from the impulsive decisions he had sometimes made in the past. This wasn't reactive or emotionally driven. It was simply the natural response of someone who had learned to trust their capacity to handle whatever arose. He wasn't afraid of making the wrong decision because he had developed confidence in his ability to adapt and respond skillfully to whatever consequences emerged. The flight to his hometown gave Marcus time to observe how thoroughly his internal landscape had changed. Instead of the familiar anxiety and mental rehearsal that used to accompany any significant travel, he found himself simply present with the experience of being 30,000 feet above the earth, watching clouds drift past his window like slow-motion explosions of white against the blue sky. At the hospital, his father looked smaller than Marcus remembered, diminished by the standard issue gown and the tangle of monitoring equipment. But his eyes lit up when he saw his son, and Marcus felt a wave of uncomplicated love that would have terrified his earlier self with its intensity and vulnerability. "You didn't have to come," his father said, but his gratitude was obvious. "I wanted to come," Marcus replied, and realized it was completely true. Not because he felt obligated or guilty or afraid, but because love naturally expressed itself through presence when barriers were removed. They spent the afternoon talking in a way they hadn't in years. Marcus's father shared stories about his own youth, his fears about aging, his pride in his children's accomplishments. Marcus listened without the usual urge to fix or advise or analyze. He simply received his father's words as gifts, responding with his own authentic thoughts and feelings as they arose. "You seem different," his father observed near the end of the visit. "More settled, somehow." Marcus considered the observation. Settled wasn't quite right, but he understood what his father meant. There was a quality of presence, of being fully where he was rather than partially somewhere else, that represented a fundamental shift from his previous way of being in the world. "I stopped trying to be someone other than who I am," Marcus said finally. His father nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, which perhaps it did to someone who had lived long enough to see the futility of elaborate self-improvement projects. Flying home the next evening, Marcus realized that something had crystallized during the hospital visit. The man who had spent years constructing elaborate defenses against life's uncertainties had been replaced by someone who could respond to whatever arose with presence and skill. Not because he had developed supernatural powers or transcended human limitations, but because he had stopped wasting energy on the impossible project of controlling outcomes. The weak self that had once required constant protection had been revealed as a mirage. In its place was something that couldn't be destroyed by others because it wasn't a thing at all, it was a way of being, a quality of presence that existed in relationship with whatever was actually happening rather than in opposition to it. Back home, Marcus returned to his work and routines, but everything felt different. Not dramatically transformed, but subtly reoriented around what was real rather than what was imagined. He continued to experience challenges and setbacks, continued to feel uncertainty and occasional anxiety. But these experiences no longer defined him or limited his capacity to respond effectively. Marcus had learned the most paradoxical truth of all: the more completely he gave up trying to protect himself from life, the more truly invulnerable he became. Not because nothing could affect him, but because he was no longer separate from the world that might affect him. He had discovered what existed beyond the prison of self-protective thoughts, and, having tasted that freedom, he could never again be fully satisfied with anything less. The power of leaving his head behind and entering real life hadn't made him into someone special or extraordinary. It had simply revealed the extraordinariness that had always been available when he stopped getting in his own way. And that, Marcus realized, was more than enough.